I mean, look, we know that Donald Trump is announcing these reciprocal tariffs, but actually the extent of his levies remains unclear.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds very generous, the president saying he's going to show leniency, but reciprocal is just a euphemism for higher. America's biggest trading partners are going to see higher tariffs imposed on their goods imported into the U.S. Donald Trump has been complaining about the U.S.'s unfair trade relationships dating back to the 1980s, and that culminates tomorrow in a Rose Garden ceremony where he's going to settle some of those scores.
I mean, when he says he's promising to be kind, Roz, what exactly does he mean?
Well, that is the question. I mean, even if he announces tariffs that are not, it's not a blanket percent, but it's actually like depending on your country or whatever. I mean, as Brendan was saying, it's still increasing tariffs, and in some cases, potentially stacking tariffs upon tariffs upon tariffs. So these add on to other tariffs that are already in place or announced recently, and so you're getting a very complex soup here in terms of tariffs on certain goods, and that's a lot for countries to absorb and deal with and work out how to navigate. I mean, obviously he's got competing demands on himself in a way in all of this. He wants to show he's raising money, even though this is really more sort of an issue for US consumers who are paying more versus revenue raising. He needs to show some room to negotiate because he always wants to negotiate going forward. So this is the starting point perhaps for changes, but also he needs to show that he's being tough. So he's got all those competing demands. So where kind fits into that, it's a bit hard to know.
Yeah, and for market participants, I know there's a lot of noise and you have to, move away from that. But actually, what does the president want to achieve at the end of the day, Hugh? And will it be inflationary?
And that's the critical question about the objectives that are being targeted. If you go back to February when the first announcements were made on Canada and Mexico, this was about immigration, this was about drugs crossing the US border. In other words, it was about foreign policy goals, and therefore quite quickly we could get to the point where a deal could be struck, tariffs walked back, and markets were quite happy at the time to dismiss tariff headlines as a negotiating position and really bluster. What's changed in the past couple of months is the objectives that are being cited. So as Ros mentioned now, you have a broader goal to reshore manufacturing, you have the consideration around raising revenues, potentially in order to fund tax cuts later this year. And I think the most challenging thing for investors is that some of those goals are contradictory, right? You can't reshore manufacturing and raise lots of revenues, and therefore it's unclear how much of what we're going to hear tomorrow is a first negotiating stance or actually a tariff that's going to persist well into the latter part of this year, because your macro impact differs a lot.
But so, Hugh, what do you think the North Star is? I know, there's a lot of talk again about the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which we talked about yesterday on TV. At the end of the day, does President Trump look at a lower dollar, or does he want a lower dollar, or what will be his, measure of success?
So a lower dollar and lower 10-year bond yields seem to be the two key areas of focus for this administration. Now, obviously, the extent to which you can do that without challenging the long-term growth prospects for the economy is a bit of a conundrum. But from my perspective, I think two things are clear about the US. This, A, clearly weighs on growth, and we're seeing that already in the capex intention surveys in particular, and B, it puts upward pressure on inflation. Now, the extent to which those two move is obviously the key challenge, but this is where you take Friday's labour market report, it becomes really significant, because for the Fed, at the moment, they don't know the difference between this growth and inflation shock, and it's likely the labour market data that would move them off the sidelines.
And then, Brendan, you have industries basically trying to carve out, their special kind of moratorium, U.S. car makers seeking concession for auto tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. So the auto tariffs for fully made cars kick in on Thursday, but for parts, there's another month of a lag for those to kick in. So the automakers are looking at both of those and saying we can absorb some of it, but all of it we can't absorb. They import components from all over the world, basically South Asia, North Africa, and so they're trying to make the case to the president that, look, if you don't give us an exclusion on some of this, then there are going to be job losses, there are going to be profit reductions, and really it's going to work counter to what you're aiming to do.
Yeah, and Roz, I mean, this is not an economic tool only, right? This is also a political tool. So could there be U-turns? Is there anything that leaders are now trying to do to soften the blow, or are they holding strong?
Well, you see a lot of leaders wanting to have direct conversations with the US, thinking maybe if they can just get in the room with Donald Trump or some of his senior officials, you get the right official, you get the right ear, and maybe you get some special treatment for yourself, be it Australia, the UK, the EU, or countries in Asia. But you also see the tough messaging coming, which is the EU even this morning saying, we're ready. If you come for us with reciprocal tariffs, we will come for you. I mean, the interesting thing is they're not necessarily retaliating straight away. They are giving themselves a bit more space, which seems to be a slightly different tactic, perhaps adopting the Mexico model of just sitting a bit quietly and letting Trump stew a bit before they respond. But so that seems to be one way that they're acting. But obviously, they're all trying to carve stuff out for themselves alongside key companies. I mean, Brendan just mentioned the auto sector. So you have a staggered approach. They have built that latency in where you get, first of all, it's entire cars and then it will be parts. And so, again, Trump always leaving room to negotiate and to change his mind because, again, that's how he operates, be it whether he's looking at these things through a foreign policy lens and using tariffs as a political tool there or as an economic and market one.
Yeah, I mean, the other concern, and this took a lot of people by surprise, is that, you know, there's a lot of U.S. chip giants now that are in limbo because of what we heard from Howard Lutnick pushing for bigger investments back home. Again, what does it mean for the industry, or in general, is there a question about U.S. exceptionalism that markets have to grapple with now, not wait 6-8 months?
It's absolutely a question for now. And you think where we started from at the beginning of this year, a very broad, crude consensus was that the U.S. administration was going to be brilliant for the U.S. economy and terrible for everywhere else, quite simply put. And so what we're seeing so far this year is question marks on both sides of that. You're seeing the exceptionalism of the U.S. growth story clearly called into question at the same time as you're seeing actually a much stronger than expected policy response coming from other regions. And so when you look at how markets are moving, if the next leg of this is to start to put more pressure on the tech sector, that should be another factor that supports this rotation into international markets.
Yeah, but will it also play off, I guess, countries against each other? Is that part of, if you do a lot of uncertainty and make sure that leaders are kind of competing to grab your attention, then it makes it where everyone's worse off?
Well, that's what he's also very good at doing. We can see that even in Europe. So you've got Emmanuel Macron, the French leader, trying to build on his personal relationship with Donald Trump. We obviously saw that the leader of Finland really hit it off with Trump recently because they play golf together and managed to get a deal for icebreakers out of it for Finland. So they are all negotiating their own corner. The challenge for Brussels when it comes to the EU is to get that kind of European unity to hold everybody to hold the line because each country in Europe is impacted differently by tariffs. So it's not as though one's better off, they're not all worse off or better off at the same. So they have a vested interest. If you're, obviously car makers in Germany, that's a real concern. And so you can see each leader is going to be trying to get the most advantageous thing for themselves, even if in theory they're negotiating as a bloc.